We're in an early model JK with an 8-speed and an LT1. We've done a couple of dozen of these now, so I'm getting comfortable with them, and I can only say that when I drive these now, they feel normal to me. In the past, the torque and the way the transmission shifted was a little unusual, but now they've become the norm, and when I get in something else like an LS or a Hemi, they feel strange. They don't have the torque, they don't have that instant power when you touch the throttle. They're not always on the pipe, meaning this 8-speed, no matter where you're at in the power band, you always have that available torque to you. There is no revving the motor up anymore. This JK isn't unusual. It's just an early JK with the usual mods. It is a two-door. A lot of guys ask me, can you do a LT in a two-door? Yes, this is an 8-speed, and this Jeep has been lifted, so the drive shaft angle is not too steep, but there's zero vibration in this. It's very smooth. The transmission shifts so smooth it almost feels like a 1-speed. I drove an LT1 8-speed in a Jaguar earlier today, an XJ6, and it ran just great. Had a lot of power, very docile, and I drive this JK and it feels exactly the same. Even though this is a JK that weighs over 5,000 pounds, it still feels light. It still feels nimble. That feeling you get with a V6 where the engine is struggling to do what you want it to do, you never get that feeling with an LT. It always feels low stress. Whenever you give it throttle, it just pulls and it doesn't make a lot of noise. Doesn't have a lot of drama to it, low RPM. Now, of course, if you get on it hard, it's going to rev up and it's going to take off like a muscle car. But that's one of the beauties of the LT, is that you get that horsepower, but you also get the low-end drivability. So as I've said in my last couple of videos, in my opinion, these engines, especially the 6.2s, have similar power to the last generation high horsepower crate motors like the 500-ish horsepower LS3s, but they have the drivability of a stock engine. This vehicle I'm driving now has a quiet muffler in it, and you really don't hear the engine. Now, in some of these LTs, you might hear a little bit of mechanical noise because all the stuff going on inside of it. In this vehicle, I don't hear anything. So to say that we're pleased with the LTs, I think is an understatement, and I think the rest of the world is agreeing with that. We're starting to see a lot of the hardcore guys starting to move away from the old overhead valve, small block Chevy, LS-based engines into the LTs because they just have so much more to offer. And in the future, they're just going to offer more. I'm really excited to run a 10-speed. I'm really excited to run the superchargers. The LTs have really branched out. I think GM has put a lot of effort into keeping performance engines in their lineup. They have a hot cam LT1 that's over 500 horsepower. They have the LT4. They have the LT5, and they've got some other stuff coming out. One of the things you really can't overlook is the transmissions. If you take an 8-speed transmission and you put it in a 5 or 6-speed vehicle, it's going to make a huge difference. You put a 10-speed in, it's going to make that much more of a difference. The flip side of that is you going to put some taller gears in. By putting taller gears in, now you're going to be running lower RPM on the highway, but still launching out of the hole pretty hard. So what have I learned about these transmissions? Most of you who follow my channel know that in the early days I was a little ambiguous about the 8-speed, and that wasn't unfounded. If you look at the 8-speed Chryslers and ZFs and some of the other heavy-duty 8-speeds that were around at the time, they really weren't performing that well. They were hunting, they were looking for gears, they had some timers where they didn't know where they wanted to be, and I think the early 8L90s suffered from the same fate. But I can tell you now, starting in about 2017, these things are just awesome. They almost read your mind the way they shift. In a way, that's true because they're adaptive and they have characterization. So as you drive it, it learns how you drive. If you drive it really mellow like I do, they shift very smooth, almost like a 1-speed transmission. If you drive it aggressive, it's going to firm up the shift just like a Corvette. So they're intelligent transmissions and they're just awesome. If you were to get into a diesel truck, you would expect to have all the torque that you ever wanted or needed. You could pull a trailer, you could go up mountains, and you had no reservations about that. Well, that's kind of how I feel about the LT. With the LS, I'd get into an LS3 and I love driving the thing, but I'd have to spin that engine up to get into the power band. With these LTs, no matter where you're at idle, you're at 2,000 RPM, you're at 70 miles an hour. Whenever you give it throttle, you just go. You're not waiting for the engine to get into its power band. And it's a new sensation, it's a new feeling that we really didn't have in the past other than some of these diesel engines. Now, taking it to the next level with the LT4 is really going to be interesting because now we're going to have forced induction along with direct injection and all the other technology, including the 8 and 10-speed transmissions. It's just going to be phenomenal in my opinion. I think we're in the golden age right now of engine performance, and I've been doing this for over 30 years. And when I would take a small block Chevy and stick it into a Vega or into a CJ, they always ran great. You could wheel them and all that, but nothing compared to what we have today. I remember in the 80s when I was doing engine swaps on Toyotas and Jeeps, we were running carburetors. So they would flood out on the mountains, whether you're going up a hill or down a hill or bouncing around, going over whoop-de-doos. We don't have that issue anymore. You could expect around 10 to 12 miles per gallon. Today we're getting better than that. You could expect 250 to 300 horsepower out of a standard small block 350, or we're getting more horsepower than that today with just a 5.3. You take a 6.2 LT1 with 460 horsepower, and I've got customers getting well over 15 miles to the gallon in Jeeps with 37s, and then you consider the engine idles at 500 RPM. That's just amazing to me. So back to this Jeep. It's a pretty typical Jeep for one of my customers. He's got oversized tires and a lift, and it is a two-door, and you got to watch out with two-doors because if you lift them up too high, you can have some weird issues, and it's more of an art than it is a science. I've had two doors with 3-inch lifts, some that vibrate and some don't. It all has to do with frequency and harmonics. Two doors are short coupled, so when you get on it, front end tends to come up a little bit more. So if you have a torque steer or a bump steer issue, it's just going to be exaggerated. I've had two doors where I've actually had to back the tune off because I thought they were unsafe. This two door is running really good, very smooth. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's shifting smooth as glass. The power delivery is perfectly constant and linear. It's not like a turbocharger where you get in the throttle, then it's a rubber band effect and you wait for the engine to catch up. It's just instant. You give it a little bit of throttle, you accelerate a little bit. You give it a lot of throttle, you accelerate a lot. And it's right now. You're not waiting for it. One thing you want to keep in mind with these LTs is the gearing, as I mentioned earlier. And I've got some of these Jeeps coming in with 538s and 513s with smaller tires, and it just doesn't work right. You're not loading the engine down, you're spinning the engine up, wasting gas. Really, to get the best effect and efficiency out of an LT, you got to gear properly, and that means gear tall. So if you've got 37s, 456s work great, or even 410s if you're going to do highway driving. I got a lot of guys on 37s with 410s and LT8 speeds. When they're going up a steep hill, it might drop back into 7th because they're running well under 2,000 RPM. But then when the highway flattens out, they're in 8th gear at 1700 RPM, getting good economy. At the same time, they're still accelerating hard because this 8-speed has a 4.6 first gear. So 1, you got to gear properly. 2, pick the engine that fits your need. A lot of guys get the 6.2. It's a lot of horsepower. If you don't need a 6.2, get the 5.3. It's got plenty of horsepower for most JKs, costs less money, can run in regular gas, has a lot of advantages, and I think you'd be surprised how much power that engine has. But the reality is the LT is a more complex engine, and it does require a little bit more effort and diligence to get it to run properly in your JK. So we're finally getting the LT swap rationalized. And what you're going to see in the aftermarket is what happened to the LS. That means you're going to have anything available to you. Camshafts, intake manifolds, headers, anything you want. What the driving experience really comes down to is good drivability, linear power delivery, sound, torque. That's what makes driving fun. I've driven some of these engines that put out a lot of horsepower with big cams, and they have soft bottom ends, and you really got to wind them up to get into the power band, and that's just not fun for me. I've also driven some of these supercharged engines that have tremendous horsepower, but they sacrifice some of the drivability and the noise. Now, most of the factory engines, meaning the ones that Chrysler and GM supply with superchargers, are pretty darn good. They're running multi-bar operating systems that are designed for a supercharger, and I think that they work great. If you want something that's more than 500 horsepower, I think a factory supercharged engine like a Hellcat or an LT4 is the way to go. And the reason I say 500 horsepower is in the old days, to get 500 horsepower, you had a rump idle, and I don't like that, at least not when I'm crawling, and I don't want my eyes burning from hydrocarbons, so that really wasn't the way to go. But this 460 horsepower LT that I'm driving, in my opinion, is on par with those 500 horsepower engines and as mild as can be. I personally think that the LT4 with direct injection is going to perform right up there with the 700 horsepower engines. I think the LT5 is going to perform right up there with the 800 horsepower engines because the 10-speed transmission combined with all that bottom end torque is really going to take them to the next level. So you have everything available to you in the LT lineup. You can go anywhere from the V6, the 5.3, the 6.2s, and then the supercharged 6.2s. I put plenty of L83 5.3s in JKs with 37 to 40 inch tires, and again, they have more than enough horsepower. Will they light the world on fire? No. But is it enough? Yeah, of course it is. If you want more than that, then just get an LT1. I don't see how you're going to beat this engine for the combination of performance and cost. This engine, for the price, gives you more technology than pretty much anything else out there, in my opinion. And if you combine that with these high technology transmissions, you're going to be future-proof for the next 5 years. So we're going to take this vehicle to the mountain, and we'll be coming back with some more videos.